High school is that period for many where it was either the best 4 years or the worst 4 years of their lives. Me, well, I didn't come into high school with something to prove. I started my freshman year not knowing anybody, and I had just transferred from a private Catholic school full of kids I had known my whole life, and while there were a lot of highs and lows I experienced with that group, one thing that really held me back was that I was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. I guess you could say I was sheltered. Weird even. I got along fine with just about all of my classmates, but I was behind on following trends. I wasn't big into sports, I played Nintendo games, and I barely used my phone and Facebook account. Well, I mean, I'm still like that, but when you put these all together and mix in my introverted personality and loads of naivety, it's not hard to see why I was the Greg Heffley of my school. But despite that position at the bottom of my school's social hierarchy, I wasn't eager to switch schools. Now, this isn't a story about how I did a 180 after transferring schools, far from it, but as I look back at those 4 years of my life, high school was my salvation. And like Jimmy Hopkins in the video game Bully, his venture in a boarding school wound up being his salvation too. Before the events of Bully, Jimmy has experienced 5 fathers and was expelled from 7 schools, so while Jimmy has gone through many hardships, many of which may have been his own fault, his stay at Bulworth Academy is what shifts things around for him. Throughout the course of the game, Jimmy will interact with a bunch of varying and unique students who ask him for favors, and Jimmy always says yes to them. It's weird seeing him be a yes man, even though his mentality is typically to give people what they deserve, while simultaneously thinking everyone sucks, and this is one of my gripes with the game. Jimmy is complex, but I don't understand his motivations. It seems his motivation from the get-go is to help a student named Gary, who quickly scoops him up with the promise that the two will take over the school together, but what does that mean? Early on we see Gary as manipulative, so sure, he can get people to do what he says, but a facility like a school is much more intertwined in the web of life that getting a community of people to obey you doesn't make any sense. And then I think about the real world. So the plot of Bully is Jimmy helping Gary take over the school, except Jimmy sees right through him, so already the main character isn't even invested in the story's plot. Like I said, Jimmy will interact with the students, and while I can barely differentiate any of them, their caricature personalities and junior high insults are pretty fun to listen to, since they aren't personal attacks to me.
How are you, sir?
You're a failure! A failure!
I always knew you were a failure.
Do you know how useless you are?
You dress like a clown.
Crotchless wonder! Do you even realize how much you suck?
You ever had deodorant? I've been thinking a lot about snails recently. They're slimy.
Stuff like that adds atmosphere to the game, and if there's one thing this game excels at, it's definitely atmosphere. The town of Bulworth is filled with streets and neighborhoods that feel authentic as a world you could feasibly visit. My sister and I would actually fantasize about our own town being perfect as a location for a game like Bully, since we had that same level of diversity, including good parts of town, shitty neighborhoods, a downtown type area, industrial areas, schools up the wazoo, railroads, bridges. All we needed was some fog to emulate draw distance, and we could pretend we were running around Bulworth 2.0. And what really amplifies the charm is the game's music. The motif that plays when you're outside or biking fits the mood of the game so well. This game has a pretty solid soundtrack outside of the main theme, and throughout this video I'll be playing some tunes in the background. So returning to the students, there's 4 factions at Bulworth Academy you'll be interacting with. The jocks, nerds, preps, and greasers. There's also a bunch of random students who aren't a part of any group, like Jimmy and Gary for instance, but like reality, you don't have to exclusively be friends with people who have an identical mindset as yourself, and in my high school experience, the in-betweeners weren't really a thing. There were definitely cliques and the jocks were at the top, but instead of saying they were popular and leaving it at that, the reason I know they were popular is because they sat at the tables next to a la carte, which someone was always reserving the period before lunch. Like, you think Jesus had his last supper there, it was that valuable. And after that, the social hierarchy was a hodgepodge. There were the basketball kids, the meme regime, nerds, geeks, kids who were friends by ethnicity, and a bunch of outsiders. I'd say it was common to have friends from different cliques, but in reality, you'd see where people's allegiances lied with who they sat with during lunch. My allegiance was with the geeks. I separated geeks and nerds because the nerds had charisma and weren't gamers. I said I came into high school with a clean slate, but is it really that surprising I'd get along with kids who have literally never played baseball in their life? My experience was that I instantly became a follower to this enigma of a guy who tipped my charts for the weirdest individual I've ever met, which should have been a red flag, but he had friends, so I put my lot in with that group just because the opportunity was open. It's kind of funny though, most of those kids were in my 9th grade language arts class, and the teacher made us pick houses from Harry Potter, and coincidentally, I and the people from that group I got along with best all picked Ravenclaw.
Disclaimer, I don't know anything about Harry Potter.
But relating this back to Bully, the first people Jimmy starts to help are the nerds. I'm going to fast forward through the plot now, but often each chapter in the game revolves around helping people in the 4 cliques until you can interact with the leader of that group, and you do that by completing missions. The missions are the bulk of the game along with the classes you can attend, but I'll get to those later. Missions are usually pretty simple, often involving traveling to a location to collect an item or fight a classmate. And even though they can get pretty repetitive, what makes them feel unique from each other is that you get little peeks into the large cast of characters when initiating the mission. The only thing I find really annoying about the missions is how far you have to travel to get to them, and a lot of the time you have to do even more traveling to complete them. And if you fail a mission, you usually have to travel back to where the mission was initiated to try it again. Skateboard and bike are given to you early on to make travel faster, but the skateboard is barely faster than running, and if you go off-road for a second, you lose all your momentum. The bike is great for getting around with, but they all spawn so far away from the dorm, and even if you get a bike, someone can easily steal it after you start a mission. There's also bus stops across town, but instead of letting you fast travel from one stop to another, they only take you back to school, making them useless in most situations. So Jimmy's missions helping nerds starts an interesting arc you may not notice happening. Every time someone asks him for a favor, Jimmy doesn't do them out of the kindness of his heart, but because he'll get paid. You'll get paid for each mission you complete, but gradually the reward stops being mentioned because Jimmy's motivations have shifted to something greater. It's cool seeing how comfortable the nerds are with Jimmy after just a few missions, and this all leads up to an interaction with the nerds' leader, Ernest, who is running for student president. I would probably think nothing about the mission, but there's much to pick apart here in the grand scheme of the game. I don't know much about what responsibilities and opportunities are afforded to student presidents, but isn't this a position that Gary would want to be in if his plan is to take over the school? But instead he just disappears during this mission. He'll actually disappear a lot in this game, which makes him frustrating as a foil to Jimmy. The actual mission is just defending Ernest from the jocks who want to sabotage his candidate speech, and this is the first of many times where you get to play in first person. I don't know if it's because I'm playing the Wii version, which forces motion controls to move the camera in this mode, but it's so hard to aim. There's this weird momentum effect added on that makes the whole thing feel slippery, and in some of these missions I can't aim down for the first 5 seconds, which puts me at a massive disadvantage since these are usually missions where I'm defending someone. The last reason I wanted to talk about this mission is that the election doesn't even matter. The results aren't revealed, and considering this game focuses so heavily on the social hierarchy of the school, something like the class president seems like it should be a major plot line where the winner becomes an important character, like maybe Gary, since he wants to take control of the school. Instead, and this is where it gets annoying, Gary gets this position called the head boy that comes out of nowhere. And this isn't the only mission where continuity doesn't matter when the game doesn't want it to. Like, there's some missions where you get to help the English and art teachers, which results in the math teacher getting fired. But that boy was still teaching class the next day. The thing I hate most about this game's continuity issues is with the end of each chapter. It's not as apparent in the first one, since the boss is Russell, the school bully, but by beating him, he magically becomes an ally. You'll eventually get involved with the 4 cliques, which always involves losing their respect until you beat their leader, and after that point, the group usually won't try to fight you on sight. Gary's big plan involves making Jimmy get everyone's respect, because by proxy, Gary will get their respect, but constantly we see that everyone already listens to Gary, so his plan doesn't make sense. I think the game is misrepresenting fear as respect, and by the final chapter, it only gets worse.
Don't act dumb. You said his mom was also legally his aunt, and that he probably had webbed toes.
I don't... Well, just only on one foot.
Tad, you're not gonna take that kind of crap from this scumbag, are you?
You've been rude about Mommy. Let's get this, Papa.
So the first clique we'll infiltrate are the preps. They love boxing, so what better time than now to talk about the game's combat. It's fighting alright, you can punch, grab, and kick to knock your opponent to the ground, and there's actually a lot more attacks than I remember there being, but if you haven't forgotten, I'm playing on the Wii, so of course motion controls are implemented, which means I have to punch in real life to punch in the game, which can get really tiresome. There's some combos you can learn too if you bring this homeless guy radio transistors, and something special happens when you bring him all 6.
Take this.
My go-to move in most fights wound up being shin kicks, which makes your target fall over, and they can be timed infinitely. I'm just gonna call this topple locking from now on, but most fights are against multiple characters, which usually means you won't be able to topple lock. If your health gets low, you can refill it by making out with the girls on campus. I'd talk about this more, but did you pay attention to the first minute of this video? And there's also weapons like a slingshot, firecrackers, and marbles that you can use, but I barely use them since they're pretty situational unless you're just playing to fuck around with the NPCs. I think a lot of the fun in this game comes from dicking around. There aren't many games where you can go ham with a spud gun or ride on a Vespa and smash people's cars, and I'm guessing that's where a lot of the appeal to stuff like Bully and Grand Theft Auto comes from. But back to the story. After getting the preps to hate you, you eventually fight their leader, Darby, and one fascinating fact about Darby is that he's vulnerable in the shin.
I hope no girls saw this.
Chapter 3 is where we get to take on the Greasers. Most of the missions involve the leader, Johnny, and his girlfriend Lola. Lola's a bit of a cheater, which makes Johnny upset, and of course Jimmy gets involved, which escalates the situation, but not even Johnny is safe from the topple lock. In Chapter 4, Jimmy takes on the nerds and the jocks. It's weird that the game pushed the narrative that the nerds liked Jimmy right away, but suddenly they hate him again. Apparently Gary painted a bad picture of Jimmy behind his back, but by now you'd think that Jimmy has some credibility to his name. The obvious reason for the nerds' change of heart is so you can fight Ernest, which is the most unique of all the boss fights since it's more focused on the environment, and of course beating him regains the nerds' respect. And after that, Ernest gets Jimmy to tarnish the jock's image by making him take unflattering pictures of the head cheerleader and stealing the mascot costume. I wasn't sure if I needed to be wearing the mascot costume to progress the story. There was a point in Chapter 2 where I had to dress like a prep, so I wore the costume to my next mission because I thought it was a similar situation. Jimmy helps amend the cheerleader's image, and because I was wearing the costume, the cutscene became really cheesy.
Everybody's laughing at me. I can't bear it.
Everybody's always laughing at me.
Well, maybe you're not as insecure as I am, okay? I just wanted to be popular. Now everybody hates me.
I tell you what, you wait here. I'll get rid of those posters for you, or at least cover them up.
Would you? I'd do it myself, but I can't deal with it. I'm really losing it here.
Just hang in there.
There actually is a mission where you're supposed to wear the costume and hijack a football game, and it's my favorite mission in the game. You get to piss in the cooler, put glue on the benches, scatter marbles across the field, and switch the ball out for a decoy with a bomb inside it. And then if anyone sees you, you have to do this goofy dance that features someone else's voice, and once the dance is over, everyone just runs away.
Yeah, forward, go, forward!
You dance real good for a boy.
And the mission ends with a fight against Ted, the leader of the jocks, who is one of the least developed characters in the game. I legit thought Ted was the black guy until halfway through the fight. That's how little they used him. But with Ted defeated, all the leaders to the Cliques seem to have put their differences aside and are fine with hanging out with Jimmy. It's the perfect end, right? I mean, my high school experience didn't end with me fitting into every clique at my school, but I had a place within my social circles where I felt like I belonged. That's something I don't think I would have achieved if I hadn't transferred schools, and that's what I mean when I say that high school was my salvation. Also, one of the teachers let us play Smash Bros on the projector. That's what our happy ending was. But with everything going well for Jimmy, he becomes arrogant and decides to graffiti the town hall, and this is where everything goes downhill for Jimmy and the story. Everyone suddenly hates Jimmy again, and Gary has convinced the dropouts from the industrial park to release rats in the school library, burn down the gym, steal the prep's boxing trophies, and submit Johnny into an asylum.
Look at this stupid fucking list.
And then there's a side plot where Jimmy befriends a girl from the industrial park, because if this game needed anything at the last minute, it was a love interest. She only becomes relevant because she knows that part of town well, which is important for the next mission when Jimmy gets expelled because Gary has the principal wrapped around his finger. If only this game gave a shit about making us believe Gary has influence. And I don't know if there's a line of dialogue I missed or it's cut content, but Jimmy figures out the leader of the townies is some kid named Edgar.
I've got to talk to that Edgar kid.
Who the fuck is Edgar? Nobody talks about him, but he has an entire dungeon of puzzles and fights before you find him. If he's this big of a deal, why don't we hear about him until after Jimmy breaks into his hideout? It's just so jarring because the fight with him is kinda hype too until you can spam the same attack on him. And while we were gone finding Edgar, Gary somehow gets the entire school to turn on itself. Too bad we don't get to find out how. But Jimmy chases Gary up to the school's roof, and this moment should be intense, but like I've been saying, Gary is an underdeveloped antagonist. He could have been such a cool puppet master, but we never got to see him perform. The final boss fight has to make up for it though, right?
What are you doing?
So that's the story to Bully. I feel like I was pretty harsh on this game, but I think it would be much more enjoyable when played casually. Like I said, I think the appeal to this type of game is its violence and its atmosphere, and the most casual part about the game are the classes you can take. Classes are cool in concept, but they can be pretty awful to sit through. That's why minigames work better than lectures. There's 10 classes you can take, all with 5 different tests that get more difficult the further you go, and when you complete one, you unlock skills like improved aiming, receiving more health when making out, sick bike hops, and new weapons to use. There's Chemistry and Shop, which are both games where you do the actions on screen. These are the easiest and also the least interesting to talk about. Chemistry was the only science class I didn't like taking IRL. The formulas always tripped me up, and I was afraid of screwing up labs all the time. English is a word jumble. I love doing word jumbles, but the time limit makes this one of the tougher classes to complete. Language arts wasn't something I cared too much for in high school. I like storytelling, but I don't like reading. I minored in creative writing, so I guess that's a reason for you to start dumping on my scripts. Art is this game called Cliques. Quicks? I'm just wondering why the teacher is posing like this. There's a mission where Jimmy thinks he's gonna date her. Hello? Miss Phillips, are you grooming students? If you couldn't tell from all my thumbnails, I like to draw. Now, if I had to draw with the Wii Remote, that's a different story. Biology is a dissection minigame where you draw with the Wii Remote. It's not difficult, but it can be frustrating because you're using the Wii Remote. I've dissected a starfish and a frog in my science classes, but I'd rather not look at internal organs. Or organs in general, really. Gym is wrestling and dodgeball. I love dodgeball, but changing clothes in the locker room during junior high has never made me feel more insecure about wearing whitey tighties. But real talk, underwear is infinitely more comfortable than boxers. Facts, drop mic, send tweet. Music is Guitar Hero Jr. When I was in band, I wanted to be percussion, but it was an elite group and you had to know how to play the piano first, so I played the clarinet. No homo. In photography, you run around the map and take pictures. I always thought I'd like photography, but I'd rather take pictures for memories than for the craft. Math is fun outside of anything asking for the metric system, and geography is literally geography. I am so sorry, Middle Eastern countries, I have no idea where you are. So overall, the classes are fun to do on the side, and the bonuses for completing them are worth it. They're good palate cleansers in between the missions, but they rotate on a 5-day schedule, so if you have one class left and screw it up, you have to play for an hour at minimum to get another opportunity. And the last two things I want to mention are the random minigames you can play and the collectibles. There aren't many minigames available, but there's a couple arcade games and activities like paper routes and lawn mowing that you can play. I just wish there were more of these because they add to the culture of Bullworth in subtle ways. There's also items like rubber bands and trading cards scattered around the map. I don't typically try to complete these types of things, but they add it to the imagination of living in a bully game. Around my town there was this band that had a bunch of stickers on signposts and streetlights a long time ago, and my sister and I thought that would be the perfect collectible to find in our real life game. So in the end, do I think Bully is a good game? Well, it's probably the best execution of a high school simulator we'll ever get, and if you play it just for that, you'll probably have a blast. But if you're looking for something with dynamic gameplay and an enriching story, you might want to pass on this one. So that's going to be it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave a like to help the channel grow and subscribe to get updates on my uploads as soon as they happen. But until then, I will see you all next time.